Okay, just wanted to make a brief episode on a paper I just read that came out in December. It's called Mapping the Genetic Landscape Across 14 Psychiatric Disorders. I think it was published in Nature Medicine, if I remember correctly. Basically, it was a type of genome-wide association study for a bunch of different psychiatric disorders. So they're trying to find genetic variants that are correlated with psychiatric disorders and then come up with a model that can kind of cluster some of those disorders together. Basically, are there DSM diagnoses that naturally clump together in genetic space, if you will? And so they looked at, as the title suggests, 14 child-onset and adult-onset psychiatric disorders, generally DSM diagnoses, looking at which alleles, which genetic variants, particularly single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, tend to be represented or most correlated with a particular psychiatric condition. And this was a pretty large sample that they're working with, over 1 million cases. And I think they were able to find a set of SNPs or genetic variants that on average explained around 66% of the overall variance in the data. So then they, again, tried to cluster these genetic variants. Basically, they found that there were 5 clusters where the disorders in each cluster had a high overlap in the genetic variants. So the first factor or cluster they called SB, which stands for schizophrenia bipolar disorder. And because that factor was composed of schizophrenia diagnoses and bipolar disorder diagnoses, they also had an internalizing factor. And you'll see the terms externalizing, and internalizing oftentimes in psychological research and psychiatric research. And internalizing essentially means something along the lines of people that tend to be self-critical, ruminate, have a negative affect bias, things like that. Whereas externalizing is more outward focused, people that tend to blame the world, blame other people, focused on things outside of themselves. The third factor they found was a compulsive factor, and this comprised diagnoses like OCD, Tourette syndrome, anorexia. A fourth factor was a neurodevelopmental factor, which included things like autism. And the last factor was a substance use disorder factor, which basically included most of the different named substance use disorders: cannabis use disorder, stimulant use disorder, nicotine use disorder, all those more specific substance use disorders. And then they tried to figure out, of the genetic variants that seem to be most associated with these particular factors, what did those genes do? And then they also had a hierarchical model where there was a node at the very top that they called a P factor. And this has been described in other studies prior. So the overall model structure is not that novel, but the P factor was basically a set of genetic variants that seem to be shared amongst all of these disorders and all of the 5 factors. And then within the 5 factors were genetic variants that were mostly associated with just those factors. So then they tried to look at, of the genetic variants, of the alleles or SNPs that were associated with these different factors, what did those genes do functionally? What proteins did they encode for? And some of the results were surprisingly unsurprising. For example, the substance use disorder factor had genes like alcohol dehydrogenase, which is, of course, involved in ethanol metabolism. And there is a SNP in one of the nicotinic receptor subunits. So that might suggest that people with particular kinds of metabolism for these substances or receptors for these substances make them more likely to get addicted to those substances. I think that makes common sense. For example, some people, when they drink alcohol, they feel unwell. It doesn't bring them any enjoyment. And so they're pretty unlikely to develop an addiction to something that doesn't make them feel good. Whereas other people, alcohol has a very calming or even euphoric effect. And so things that make you feel good, you're more likely to get addicted to. But what makes you feel good and what makes you feel bad can vary depending on a lot of things, in particular, maybe some of the metabolism of these substances or how well they bind to certain receptors in the brain. So the substance use disorder genes were sort of the most on the nose, and the rest were less obvious. So of the P factor genes, the ones that seem to be shared amongst all the disorders, they were just general biological process genes. Like they said that they were mostly gene regulation related, so nothing very specific. And then for the SV factor, the schizophrenia bipolar factor, there were genes involved in neuron development, especially excitatory neurons. The internalizing factor was less clear than that. There were some excitatory neuron genes involved there as well, but it was less consistent. And from what I remember, I don't think there was anything very compelling for the compulsive factor. So on the one hand, you could argue that these data suggest that the DSM splits diagnoses too much and that it has too many artificial boundaries between disorders. And clinically, we see that, at least in terms of just clinical snapshots, seeing somebody at particular points of time, it can be impossible to tell whether someone in a psychotic state has bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And the genetic relationship or shared relationship between those two disorders has been described before. And so it does beg the question of whether they really are truly distinct disorders or different presentations of the same disorder. On the other hand, though, one of the limitations of the study is the fact that a lot of the time, people's diagnoses change. How many times have you seen someone diagnosed with bipolar disorder that later gets diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then later someone else re-diagnoses them with bipolar disorder? And so just the clinical uncertainty with a lot of these diagnoses corrupts some of these findings. Not completely, but it probably distorts it to some degree. The other thing that I would point out is that while certainly there are genetic risk factors for different psychiatric conditions, taking the analogy of brain as information processor or brain as computer, and I'm not someone who thinks that this analogy is one-to-one by any means, but if you have a million copies of a program, a really complicated program, let's take Adobe Photoshop or Microsoft Excel, some program that's got millions of lines of code, and you're running a million copies of these complicated software programs on different computers, some percentage of them crash, right? I'm sure everybody's had a situation where their program doesn't work as intended. It crashes, it does something unintended. And yet the code is identical across all these machines, right? The software code is identical. And that's because the different people might ask the program to do different things, and they might put it into a regime that was unintended by the original software programmers. And so then it malfunctions. And so if you did a GWAS on that, it wouldn't be very revealing because all the code is identical, and yet you still get what appears to be a disorder. So I don't think we'll find all the answers of the biology of psychiatric disorders at the gene level, but it might help. So anyways, that's all I got to say about that. Interesting paper. Hope that was helpful.